Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Vanessa Davidson, and I'm the curator of Latin American art here at the Blanton. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this virtual symposium, New Perspectives on Contemporary Colombian Art, Oscar Muñoz in Context, which celebrates the closing of the exhibition Oscar Muñoz Invisibilia here at the Blanton. This afternoon, you will hear from four trailblazers, four leading scholars in their fields who will use this exhibition as well as Oscar's work more broadly as kind of a launching pad or jumping off points of departure for discussing other parallel or divergent practices in contemporary Colombian art. And they will also put in context Oscar's wonderful space called Lugar a Dudas that he founded in 2005 in Cali as kind of a community center for artists to interact with members of the community, but also for education, artist residencies and exhibitions. So you'll hear about a whole range of topics today in Colombian contemporary art. I wanted to just give you a few notes on the background of the exhibition before we begin. Invisibilia was, in fact, the first retrospective that Oscar Muñoz has ever had in the United States. It seems very strange that it should be so late and so overdue because he's had retrospectives throughout Latin America and exhibitions across Europe, but this is the first time that there's been a real survey of his work in the US. And the exhibition includes approximately 50 works created between the 1970s and then in the subsequent 5 decades up until today, including some works that made their debut in this exhibition. Now, Oscar was born in 1941 in Popayán, Colombia, and he lives and works in Cali. He describes his practice as an effort to hacer memoria, to make memory. And he describes the situation in Colombia as an immemorial setting because violence extends back beyond memory. And so by focusing on what he defines as, quote, the impermanent and the intangible, end quote, he explores the elusive phenomena of memory, history, and time by giving them visible physical form, but only fleetingly, as you see here, just as we too are so prone to forgetting. And this is this phenomenon is what really underlies my choice of the title Invisibilia, because his images waver in and out in a liminal space between erasure and appearance, visibility and disappearance. But what is so radical about his practice is that in so doing and exploring these themes, what he's done over the past 5 decades is to radically deconstruct the photographic medium and then reconstruct it, creating hybrid works that splice photographic processes with printmaking, painting, sculpture, video, installation, and even interactive works. And I believe that, despite being awarded the 2018 Hasselblad Award in photography, which is the highest honor of photography can hope to achieve, he's not truly a photographer, as you see here. He uses photography as a mnemonic device to prompt us to reconsider how our own memories of the past inform our current lives, our contemporary lives. So his multifaceted artworks erode distinctions between the personal and the universal, between identity and anonymity, and between knowledge and ambiguity. And although they're deeply rooted in the Colombian context, his works have universal resonance. As you will hear from our 4 esteemed scholars this afternoon, who include Jerónimo Duarte-Riascos, María Wills, Londoño, Ana María Reyes, and Bernardo Ortiz. Before we begin, I'd like to just go over a few points of housekeeping. Your audio is muted, so no one can hear you, and only the panelists are visible on screen. Closed captioning is available by clicking the live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen, And we'll be taking your questions at the end of all 4 presentations, at the end of the symposium, from the Q&A window. You just click the icon below to type and send your questions. Feel free to make comments in the chat window, but please ask your questions through the Q&A module, because that's where we'll be looking for them. This afternoon's event is being recorded and will be available on our website and our YouTube page roughly 1 week from today. So all of our panelists are here, except for María Wills, who is in fact right now at the inauguration of a show that she curated at the Fundación MAPFRE in Madrid, on the Venezuelan photographer Paolo Gasparini. But Ana Maria, Jerónimo, and Bernardo are here, and we will leave about 30 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. And after the first 2 talks, we will have a 15-minute recess. Now, to begin, let me introduce Jerónimo. Jerónimo Duarte-Riascos is an assistant professor of Latin American and Iberian cultures at Columbia University. His research, teaching, and curatorial projects concentrate on modern and contemporary artistic practices with special attention to their literary and visual manifestations in Latin America. He completed his PhD in Spanish and Latin American literatures with a secondary field in visual environmental studies at Harvard University. Prior to joining Colombia, Duarte-Riascos was a visiting assistant professor of Spanish and Portuguese at Northwestern University and lectured at the University of Chicago and Harvard University. He has worked at several museums, including MoMA New York and the Harvard Art Museums, and he is a founding member of the curatorial collective Decadence Curadoria. He lives and works in New York. Welcome, Jerónimo, and we are so looking forward to your talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Jerónimo Duarte-Riascos, and I'm an assistant professor of Latin American and Iberian cultures at Columbia University. Before I begin, I want to thank Vanessa Davidson for curating this wonderful show and for inviting me to be a part of the symposium today. I also wanted to thank Justin O'Connor and everyone at the Blanton for their support in putting this event together. And I have to say that I'm very honored and humbled to be in the company of such brilliant minds today. Ana Maria, Bernardo, and Maria have all been very important for my own thinking, and I have the utmost respect for all of them. So I'm excited to share this virtual space with them. The talk that I'm going to give today is entitled The Unintelligibility of the Real, Thoughts on Oscar Muñoz and Other Cases in Colombian Contemporary Art, and is part of a larger work in progress that explores the ways in which Colombian contemporary artists use fiction to question our ability to understand the world and reintroduce doubt as a guiding principle of relationality and sense-making. It is a project that is in its very early stages, so this is by no means a polished argument, but more of a collection of thoughts. I'm very excited by the ideas that will hopefully come from today's discussion later. So I want to start with an image, one that is probably familiar to most of you. This is Proyecto para un Memorial, a 5-channel video installation that Oscar Muñoz produced in 2005. There, the spectator witnesses a hand hastily sketching different faces using water on stone. Naturally, the water evaporates quickly, causing the inevitable disappearance of the image. The evanescing faces belong to dead individuals and are based on photographs found in the obituary pages of Colombian newspapers. Not surprisingly, this work has been often read as a way to commemorate and remember those who are gone. It is, after all, a project for a memorial, as an attempt, perhaps a failed one, to grasp a reality that risks disappearing. The artist has stated that he is interested in the instant and the processes that occur so that an image can become consolidated or not in memory. And this preoccupation is certainly visible in the piece. One could argue that the memorial alludes to a sort of cycle, visible as well in other pieces by the artist. There's an object-subject in the world, a human being of flesh and bone, that Muñoz turns into an image in an effort to save them from oblivion. Yet, at the same time, he makes the image unstable, fleeting, and we, as spectators, witness its disappearance. This disappearance, in turn, returns us to the object, even if only to acknowledge that it's gone forever, that time has passed and lives have been lost. Today, I want to propose a different cycle to read Muñoz's work, one in which the object of remembrance is not only the human of flesh and bone, but rather the unintelligibility of the real. The cycle would be as follows. There's an object subject in the world, a human being of flesh and bone, that is captured by a fiction, the photograph in the newspaper. This photograph is later used by the artist to produce another fiction, a new image, but one that negates the illusion of stability promised by photography. Then Muñoz's image disappears. This time, however, the disappearance does not bring us back to the object, the world, the real, but rather reminds us of our impossibility to approach, understand, and make sense of the real without the mediation of fiction. To put it simply, my claim is that Muñoz's work fosters a philosophical positioning of doubt while ennobling fiction as a tool to negotiate epistemological uncertainty. His works dissolve the illusion according to which we believe that the real can be fully comprehensible, interpreted, and preserved. And faced with this impossibility, fiction arises as solace. Often, Oscar Muñoz's pieces start with a fiction, not with a falsity, but with a construction, an artificial crafting that determines a particular engagement with the real, a photographic image, for instance. María Méndez, in her essay for the catalog that accompanies Invisibilia, argues that Colombian artists of the 1970s used the photographic gaze as an instrument of reality editing, that is, a device for sense-making, that granted them a freedom that, for various reasons, was not available before. Muñoz, Méndez argues, productively engages with this photographic gaze as a starting point for some of his pieces. It is visible, for example, in works from the series Interiores, mostly produced during the 80s. Other times, it is a proper photograph that serves as source material. More specifically, he uses images that claim to objectively refer to the real. Newspaper photographs, as in Proyecto para un Memorial, or entire newspaper pages, as in País Tiempo from 2007, identity headshots like in 4x3 from 2013 to 2017, maps, as seen in Ambulatorio from 1994, and depictions from books like those used for Libro Abierto in 2019. As visible in the images I just showed you, Muñoz takes these fictions, these photographic images, and intervenes them to question their legitimacy. Blurring, disappearing, fragmenting, burning. From there, we are faced as spectators with two immediate options. We can assume that the fallibility that was just enacted is, in fact, a property of the image, that representations are always partial and to some degree false, that the appearance of art is deceiving and manipulative, etc. Or we can go a slightly different route. We can read the waning of the image as saying something about the world, as underscoring its unintelligibility. The difference between the two approaches is small, but I think significant. It is not that images are deficient, that they fade, that they're unstable like memories, and that with time, they end up losing their connection to the real because in one way or another, the real acts on them. They are destroyed by the power of natural elements or the power of forgetting. It is the opposite. Images fix, capture the real, or at least attempt to do so. They give us the illusion that there is a possibility to access the world, to understand it, to remember it. Is it possible then to read Muñoz's work as a practice that destroys the image to bring us back to the real and remind us that our only hope to grasp it as present, as past, as future is through fiction, imperfect as it may be? Is it possible then to see his works as enacting the inapprehensible character of the world and simultaneously underscoring the deficiencies of fiction as the only tool available to attempt to grasp it? If we doubt the tool that gives us access to the real, are we bound to doubt the real as well? Muñoz's fleeting images function as what Jean-Paul Sartre termed the analogon, a stimuli that serves as an equivalent for perception. Sartre, writing in 1940, was interested in theorizing the dematerializing function of consciousness to address the difference between perception and imagination. For him, perception was inevitably partial, incomplete, and could only develop diachronically. Imagination, on the other hand, was total, instantaneous, and conditioned by our intention. Consequently, the way in which we experience objects, the world, in our minds is radically different from the way in which we experience them phenomenologically, for lack of a better word. Following this logic, the world is simply impossible to access via perception. We are left then with imagination, which was terrifying for Sartre, nor so scary for Muñoz, I think. Imagination is consequently more powerful and arguably more practical than perception, given the effect of totality and certainty it produces. The problem is that we tend to confuse these two. Not only we mistakenly feel, and the affect is important here, that what we imagine is what is, or what was, but we mistakenly believe that the world can be accessed as a totality, with the certainty with which we are able to access an imaginary image. Most of the images that serve as source material for Muñoz have the pretension to function like the imaginary images discussed by Sartre. Even when they are presented as the result of perception, they are intended to activate and, in a way, condense a total image of what is being depicted without acknowledging the impossibility of such enterprise. Take, for instance, El Juego de las Probabilidades. The work consists of 12 color photographs, each depicting a different self-portrait of the artist. Each self-portrait was produced with fragments of former identity photographs that were once used to represent the totality of Oscar Muñoz as Colombian national, as a citizen authorized to drive, etc. The artist cut the original images, the source materials, and interwove them to produce a new portrait, highlighting the material and philosophical impossibility of the claim that any of these original images make. There are then 3 steps in this operation. First, we have the identity photos, the source materials that at different moments in time claim to capture the artist objectively. As such, these photographs aim to function as the Sartrean analogon and activate a mental image that would account for Muñoz as a totality. Second, we have the artwork. Muñoz literally tears the image apart, slices it to produce a new analogon, but one that overly questions the possibility of a total perception. And lastly, in the encounter with the spectator, there is a mental image produced, but one that, unlike the one Sartre describes, is aware of its fragmentary condition and consequently reminds us of the impossibility to fully access the world. Yet, El Juego de las Probabilidades thus allows us a glimpse of a possible Oscar Muñoz and, by proxy, of ourselves, because we too have been the subject of identity photographs, and we too know well that the totality of the self does not reside in any of those images. After encountering El Juego de las Probabilidades, one may produce an image that aspires to capture the real Oscar Muñoz as subject, object in the world. However, at the same time, one is reminded of the impossibility of ever fully experiencing, let alone understanding or grasping such reality. Because, as I have been suggesting, Muñoz's work demonstrates that very unintelligibility. Muñoz, as object subject in the world is never really fully accessible to us, nor to himself. This inaccessibility of the self that also grants a glimpse of it is similarly thematized in Retrato, a 2004 piece in which the artist used the same technique as that used in Proyecto para un Memorial, but this time he sketched his own image. The self-portrait is never quite finished. The water that traces it evaporates too quickly for the totality to materialize. The single-channel video that supports the piece is displayed in loops, giving the impression of a recurrent failure to grasp the real. The piece, like so many other autobiographical works by Muñoz, succeeds in its failure. Part of the reason why Retrato's fallibility is so potent is because of its humility, because it lacks the reckless confidence of other available images, and because it introduces a doubt about the self that I think also extends to the world. Claims of certainty about the real are commonplace. Muñoz's practice erodes such certainties via minor actions, via what Natalia Brizuela has termed carbon aesthetics, that reminds us that despite all of humanity's attempts to make the world black and white, truth is, it is gray. One of the most eloquent blows to certainty in Muñoz's work is, I think, the one achieved in Impresiones Débiles. Using photographs that claim to document pivotal moments in Colombian history, the artist intervenes them as to achieve an overexposure effect and then alters the focal point. The maneuver effectively changes the image in questions, of course, the alleged objectivity of photography. But perhaps most importantly, Muñoz's piece reveals the mutability of the real according to positionality and interest. These images demonstrate that the real is dependent on the relations between the elements in it, and that such relations are arguably infinite. It is this vastness that prevents full intelligibility. Fiction, a photograph, a text, a work of art by Muñoz, can only aspire to capture a handful of those relations, because it is only in fiction where the real becomes legible. The awareness of doubt that comes with Muñoz's practice is then dual. We doubt the fiction that helps us remember, access, and preserve the world, and we also doubt our very ability as humans to ever satisfactorily access the real. There is also, I think, an ethics that unfolds with this awareness of doubt, a force that compels us to share the uncertainty, that propels us to create in our interactions with others and the world, lugar a dudas, room for doubt, like the name of the art space Muñoz founded and has sustained in collaboration with Salim Mizrachi. And nowhere is doubt about the real and the fictions we create to approach it more necessary than in a place like Colombia that has suffered for decades the unintelligibility of violence. I want to finish this presentation with some brief comments on two other cases in Colombian contemporary art that use fiction to question our ability to understand the world and reintroduce doubt as a guiding principle of relationality and sense-making. Perhaps the reading of Muñoz's work that I just proposed may function as somewhat of a constant preoccupation in the local scene, at least during recent decades. The first case I want to address is that of Miguel Ángel Rojas, in particular his 1997 work, Paquita Compra un helado. The piece, a mural drawing composed of more than 8,000 photographic reductions, resembles a comic strip and tells the peripeteia of a little girl who sets off to buy some ice cream. The photographic reductions, each of them 8 millimeters in diameter, originated in the earlier series by Rojas titled Sobre Porcelana. The images that constitute this series depict stealthy homosexual encounters that took place in the bathrooms of Teatro Mogador, a theater serving as a venue for gay cruising in the Bogotá of the 70s and 80s. The mural drawing, produced on the occasion of the exhibition Realigning Vision, Alternative Currents in South American Drawing, created by María Carmen Ramirez and Edith Gibson, narrates the story of Paquita in her quest for ice cream, the object of her desire. Paquita, which the artist has identified as his transvestite facet, leaves her home to complete a rather mundane task, one that many other kids and adults embark on a daily basis. However, for Paquita, the undertaking becomes quite harrowing. A stranger kicks her to the ground, a truck gets close to running her over, a dog attacks her, the ice cream vendor has no change, someone breaks a glass bottle near her, and lastly, Paquita's ice cream turns out to be contaminated, infecting the girl with a deadly illness. Rojas envisioned the piece as a way to speak about gay desire through both metaphor, the comic strip, and documentation, the photographs, in a time when the AIDS pandemic and conservative death squads were targeting the lives of the homosexual community. While I agree that this is readily visible, I want to expand on this interpretation to propose that the work presents three different superposed fictions that interact to state the artist's particular positioning towards the real. Rojas has experienced himself the heaviness of a world that threatens him, of a reality that doesn't seem willing to include difference, in his case, sexual difference. The artist has critiqued Colombian society for living immersed in myths, stifled by religion and other dominant discourses. In his opinion, the artist's role is to clarify the real, not only to connect us to it, but also to clarify it, destroying the myths that obscure it. But what exactly does clarifying the real means? How can one reconcile this claim with the reading I just proposed of some of Oscar Muñoz's work and their connection to an unintelligible reality? Perhaps one way to do so is to see the fiction, to illuminate it through as art. As I just mentioned, I see Paquita as signaling three distinct fictions, that is, three artificial constructions produced according to a particular intentionality. The first one is the theater as a fictional space, as severed from quote-unquote real life. One of the issues that becomes visible with Rojas's work is the utter lack of space afforded to homosexuality to operate as a defining force of the real. The theater then becomes an artificial refuge, a space of fiction, if you will, where you can see the real more clearly, both as it manifests inside and outside of the venue's doors. Second, Paquita engages with the fictionality of photography in spite of its more documentary approach. While it is true that the images capture the intensity and urgency of desire, the way in which the image is framed reminds the spectator of the fact that it only provides a glimpse. The size of the prints is reminiscent of the holes in the bathroom logs through which Rojas looked at and captured the encounters. Part of its potency comes precisely from what we don't see. The fiction of photography gives access to a minuscule part of the real just to underscore the vastness of what remains inaccessible. And lastly, of course, there is the comic strip / drawing, the fictional story of Paquita that helps us see, perhaps clarify, the very pervasive reality, risks, and often tragedy of the homosexual experience for nothing other than procuring one's object of desire. These three fictions, the fiction of the theater, the fiction of the photograph, and the fiction of the comic strip, coalesce to shed light onto the Colombian gay experience of both the 70s and the late 90s, while simultaneously illuminating those myths that Rojas so despises. Together, they cast doubt over a reality that, in the artist's eyes, has been obscured by myths. In his words, I think that in Colombia, a country that is so blind with such a closed culture, people cling on established standards to feel that they are doing the right thing because they don't dare to think in any other way. They have no other viewpoint. Paquita then introduces a new viewpoint, one that was largely absent in Colombia's public sphere at the time. In a way, the work clarifies reality as Rojas aspired to, yet this clarification is not literal. The light that is shed by his works does not make reality clearer, easier to comprehend, more intelligible. Paradoxically, to see reality more clearly means to realize its opaqueness. It means to acknowledge that otherness and difference are part of the real too, and that this belonging does not necessitate comprehension. Perhaps a shared effect of both Muñoz's and Rojas' work is the fact that they both show us that a constitutive part of the real is its unintelligibility, and that to see the world clearly implies to see its mystery. Which brings me to my last point, a brief note on the work of another Colombian artist who understood art as precisely the gateway to the mysterious, the occult. I don't have time now to delve into the complexities of Álvaro Barrios' work, but I want to end with another image. It's part of Barrios' Sueños Ilustrados, and this particular piece is from 2013. The caption on the left image reads, "I dreamt that Marcel Duchamp declared that everything in existence was art." The caption on the right continues, "And immediately afterwards, he declared that only what doesn't exist is art." Barrios' fascination with Duchamp is indicative of his understanding of the role of both art and the artist. He has repeatedly emphasized his belief in art as a practice that can make the mystery visible, as a discipline that allows us to reconnect with the mysterious, with that which we don't understand fully, with what seems operatic, unreasonable, inaccessible to the self. Art, for him, should provide the spectator and the artist with the experience of entrancement, with an experience of incomprehensible lucidity. And it is precisely this incomprehensible lucidity that the artists I reviewed today accomplish with their work. They bring clarity to the incomprehensible reality we inhabit and provide us with some tools to navigate it. Not necessarily to dispel doubt, but to comment on the importance of acknowledging the unintelligible in the self, in the other, and in the world. And that seems to me to be urgently political. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Jerónimo, for that excellent and thought-provoking talk. I look forward to our discussion period so we can pursue those themes further. Our next talk is by María Wills con Londoño. María Wills is the director of the Banco de la República art museums in Bogotá, including the Museo de Arte, the Museo Botero, and the Casa de Moneda. She is a curator, and her main projects relate to the instability of the contemporary image and the revision of official historical accounts in art. Her curatorial project, The Life of Things, La Vida de las Cosas, led to her selection as curator of the 2019 Momenta Biennial of the Image in Canada. Will's curatorial projects have been exhibited in such renowned institutions as the International Center of Photography in New York, the Jeu de Paume in Paris, the Cartier Foundation for Contemporary Art, also in Paris, the Photographers Gallery in London, the Círculo de Bellas Artes in Madrid, the Centro de la Imagen in Mexico City, the Miguel Urrutia Art Museum of the Banco de la República in Bogotá, and the Bogotá Museum of Art and the Medellin Museum of Art, among many others. And she lives and works in Bogotá. So here we will now hear María Wills' presentation, which is entitled Ruins, Traces of Memory in Contemporary Colombian Art, Oscar Muñoz, Fernel Franco, Nicolás Consuegra, Colectivo Masqui, Lela Cárdenas, and María Isabel Rueda.
Well, hello. It's a pleasure for me to be today with you. My name is María Wills. I'm a Colombian art curator, currently the director of the arts unit of the art department at the Central Bank of Colombia, where actually more than 10 years ago, I was able to do an amazing show of Oscar Muñoz photographies by invitation of Jose Roca. We were co-curators in this amazing project, which was the biggest retrospective ever done in Colombia for Oscar. And it was a beautiful show more than 1,000 square meters of this amazing approach to photography and art, and of the previous moments to this clique of photography, photography as a metaphor for memory and for history. Today, I come because I want to talk to you about this notion of memory also, but using the symbology of the ruin, and not only to talk about Oscar Muñoz's work, but other Colombian contemporary artists, as ruin can be like a common way to talk about decadence, to talk about violence, which are very, very important subjects in Colombian art of the 20th and 21st century. So I'm going to share with you, share a screen of this presentation. Oscar Muñoz, well, as you must all know, born in Popayán, but then active in Cali. I have to say that my relationship to Oscar personally, I love the personal part of exhibitions, started when I traveled to Cali for different research on the Cali group, which was a very, very powerful, creative collective of artists, cinematographers, writers, and I specifically was researching Fernel Franco, and I did many travels to Cali and was able to interview many of the peers and the people that worked closely during the 70s, and that looked at the subject of the city as a subject. So I was able to meet Oscar, to be very close to Luis Ospina, to Karen Lamazon, to I read the texts of amazing Andrés Caicedo. Eder Astudillo was one of the other artists I actually have worked with. And they had in common this interest in looking at marginal side of the city, of walking around the city, such as flaneurs, or one could say also as Guy Debord's way of just walking around the city and making that a performative part of their art. One has to say that Oscar Muñoz's work, Ambulatorio, for example, is that it's a cartography, it's a map of a city, completely torn, the shattered glass that many of us would see when terrorist bombings would take place. I'm from Bogota, but in Cali, and he remembers his walks around the city with Fernel Franco, who I will show you in the presentation, seeing the violence that the city was going through. And no doubt the artists wanted to say and talk about this process of destroying the city, of the pain that the people would live, and so the city can become actually like a circuit, a body, so this is Ambulatory, which is maps, photographs, aerial photographs of the city of Cali, which people can walk on. One has to say that one of the most powerful transformations in Oscar's process was he was able to take the bidimensional works he was doing in the 70s and 80s that were very attached to academical learning of in Cali, in Bellas Artes, in the Academy of Fine Arts in Cali, and taking works and making amazing installations. One has to say that he's one of the pioneers in these works that are not only ephemeral but participative. You have to take this into account. I don't know. So I would like to share with you some thoughts regarding other contemporary artists. The conference today is named Ruins, Traces of Memory in Colombian Contemporary Art, Oscar Muñoz, Fernel Franco, Nicolás Consuegra, Colectivo Masqui, Leila Cárdenas, and Marisabel Rueda. I start by quoting Italo Calvino, who says about the cities in his amazing book, The Invisible Cities. The one, talking about the city, includes everything that is accepted as necessary when it is not yet necessary. The others, what is imagined as possible, a minute later is no longer possible. So there's this notion of idea of a finished city, of a utopian city. What is a city supposed to be? And what are ruins? Following Hal Foster, a paradox presents itself when a temporal category is inscribed in spatial forms such as abandoned buildings and interiors. While the mechanical and commodified impacts the body, the old or outdated becomes a spatial allegory of a temporal crossroads of historical change. Thus, the obsolete takes on an extreme relevance. There is an aura to ephemeral things. So, quoting Hal Foster, we can see ruins are taken as a symbolic and poetic tool in contemporary art. Beyond Baroque nostalgia and more towards a political statement of the implicit possibilities of appropriation, of recycling, of reinvention, of apparent loss, making works out of intersecting possibilities of time, intersecting possibilities of different timings, of past, present, future. Such as Oscar Muñoz, for example, his ambulatorio or his many ephemeral pieces, transforms a piece of past that was or could have been into a future that never took place, and takes us to utopian dreams of escaping the irreversibility of time. This work is, for example, this specific work is also an index of catastrophes involving narco-terrorism in Colombia. When walking around Cali, as I mentioned before, photographer Fernel Franco, Muñoz remembers hearing an explosion that led him to a destroyed building. All the glass was scattered upon the ground below. And then in this moment, I would think that metaphorically, his work started, the dematerialization of his work started. And I think it has to do with these processes of violence taking place around Colombia. Decadence and violence were new codes of existing in a tropical city that was previously full of intellectual and modern romanticism. So this Cali group in its youth would enjoy the heat and the tropic. You know, it's a tropical city that receives the breath of the Pacific, and it's a city also that grew very intensively in the 70s, and it went through amazing cultural clashes between the popular and the more cosmopolitan. But in the 90s, the city starts going through the violence that narco-terrorism and that basically civil war are charging upon its constructions, and these works and these other artists that come from a younger generation also come up with ruins as a way of exploring this territory of the ambivalence of a city, of living in a city in a place such as Colombia, in a place also that has a lot of economic difficulties, and people would have to travel to the cities without any notion of what they would be living like. This is, for example, something that happened with Fernel Franco, who had to migrate from rural areas into the city. Anyway, but Walter Benjamin saw, and I think that it's important to bring upon the thinkers on ruin. Walter Benjamin saw ruins allegories of thinking itself, and of the way we build historical thought, the vanishing potential of materiality, and have also been connected with death. In addition, ruins are metaphors for aging and the loss of memory. When nostalgia was first diagnosed as a disease, Europe was struck by an epidemic of feign nostalgia that was just as difficult to cure as the actual one. In the history of architecture, the fashion for ruins and the discovery of archaeology went hand in hand with the construction of artificial ruins. Moreover, imagined artificial ruins might have anticipated the archaeological discoveries. It is not by chance that many 17th and 18th century paintings of ruins presented them as porous architecture. Ruins appear as vegged gateways to the landscape. Elaborate man-made frames that mediated between history and nature, between architecture and the elements, the inside and the inside and the outside of dwellings. So the time of the fascination for ruins coincided with a fascination for new optic devices, such as the camera, actually. For lorgnettes to dioramics, nostalgic vision colored the ruin gaze, which required a progressive lens for both the myopic and the farsighted. So this is an amazing quote I bring from Svetlana Boym. In a paper she writes, denominated Monument of Transformation. So ruins are part of the transformation of cities, and they tell stories. Unfortunately, many of the violence that went in heritage and amazing historical buildings in Colombia goes through also the economic models of mafias that would need to launder money, and many beautiful, beautiful heritage, as I was mentioning. So when you would talk to all these Cali group, to the movie makers, Carlos Mayolo, Luis Ospina, Fernel Franco, and Oscar, you would always hear them talking nostalgically about the amazing houses. I did walk through the cities where they would tell me, in this ugly building you see here, there was this amazing house. So it was about imagining how the city was before. And I think this is a very poetic way of going around the city. And we actually see what is an archive, which is one of the main themes in Oscar Muñoz's work. If not a ruin, if not something that is rescued by contemporary art constantly by appropriation, in order to bring these memoirs of what a city was, and of the nostalgia that was lived in this youth by this group of artists in the 70s and 80s. But so one has to say that Colombia has a different nature to this Baroque, nostalgic 17th century notion of the ruin. And nature and the nostalgia for the ruin is more of a trauma. I'm interested in briefly addressing aspects related to the ruin in some contemporary Colombian artists, and also against economic models related to easy money and drug trafficking that generated a series of real estate booms, and that degenerated in all this neglection of heritage and loss, and I would say very sad. And something that happens in Colombia a lot is that we constantly forget history. We constantly forget the violence that we have gone through, and looking at these ruins through art is, I think, an amazing way. And I'm interested in citing also pioneering works such as, for example, Gordon Matta Clark. And before going to Matta Clark, I have these, for example, initial works where Oscar is already looking into architecture as an ambience, as a way, as a place where people would live when migrating to the cities. These are inquilinatos. So these are the housing of people that would migrate to the city of Cali from rural areas because of the civil war that was starting to take place between left and right, between guerrillas, and so he starts his work by looking at these nostalgic views of the city. So I would like to talk about the work of Gordon Matta Clark, who with his on architecture inaugurated a creative language for making critical activism with a capitalist use to confront the myths of progress. This all has to do with the notion of progress. I'm a curator who's also very interested in looking at the falling of these processes of modernization, which actually were trying to promote modernity, not as understood in the beginnings of the 20th or end of the 19th century, but more towards development. So Colombia starts his modernization through this idea of development that takes place in the beginning of the century, but also goes on later on, and this development has caused a lot of trauma, as we were saying. So the myth of progress, a form of social mobility and of revolution in this notion of coexistence. And I think coexistence with a ruin is something that anyone who has visited cities such as Bogota or Cali has seen, because they coexist. They're part of the day-to-day. In Colombia, the growth of cities has been massively marked by displacement by violence. Fernel Franco recalls his arrival in Cali from the countryside for these reasons: an enchantment, though, magical enchantment by the light. In the countryside, worked with Gordon Matta Clark worked with abandoned structures, began with my concern for the life of the city, of which a major side effect is the metabolization of old buildings. The presence of empty and neglected buildings in urban centers is a reminder of ongoing fallacy of renewal through modernization. Excuse me for the delay in bringing this up. Fernel Franco, which is what I was going through. Fernel Franco recalls his arrival in Cali from the countryside for these reasons: an enchantment by the light. In the countryside at night, there is the spectacle of stars in the sky. What I saw, said Fernel Franco, in contrast, when I arrived in Cali, where the stars were on earth. He arrived on a night where brightness prevailed, but where his most outstanding photographic records reveal his interests in provoking an encounter with ruin and oblivion. His silent and slow personality allowed him to appreciate what many overlooked. And that was the multiplicity of wounds and urban scars regarding what he once stated. The violence seen in architecture and the city is a reflection of the violence that people live in the cities, in the margins of the cities, the poverty that we see in Latin American cities. Franco, as a reporter, claims to have been confronted with dead bodies as he fired the flash of his camera when he was a reporter of the news and the newspapers where he started his career. Likewise, the darkness of the detenments, homes for the displaced homeless, were also ruins for the emptiness of being in these transitional spaces. The image is lived as a sculptural space, hence the link between Franco and the powerful practice of Oscar Muñoz, who beginning in the 90s abandoned the plane of his drawings to work with ephemeral and three-dimensional works. The selected artists face the challenge of reinventing the photographic technique and in some cases make this the center of their work. But this is always a questioning that is quite political. Is the ruin a metaphor for failure? Or is it a symbol of persistence And is it necessary to incorporate it as a permanent space and not a transitional one? The avant-garde and its neo and post versions have confirmed the need to create hybridizations. Surrealism generated all kinds of dialogues, and artists such as Man Ray and Brassai worked between the photographic and the sculptural permanently, questioning the univocal definition of each medium, and even recognizing in these hybridations a critique of the categorizations of Europeizing thought. Brassai published in the surrealist magazine Minotaur his photographs of involuntary sculptures. And I see actually involuntary sculptures when I see Oscar Muñoz's work and the ruins, which are a space in between a building and the destruction and nothingness. I see sculptures, and I also see a beautiful, beautiful notion of these photographs as involuntary sculptures in his Amarrados. So they showed various objects, the original involuntary sculptures, mostly discarding, including small portable ruins. So Brassai would see these objects, discarded objects, as ruins, such as the crust of a loaf of bread, a rolled up bus tickets, among others. These images beyond the object reveal the ambiguity of the sign and its referent, as well as the deficiencies of art. I'm bringing up these found objects. To use ruins is to enable invention and representation, and to understand the testimonial capacity of non-obvious things. It is to find and understand the archive and the document in the paraphernalia of the everyday, including spaces full of life. Not of a vital or dynamic life, but full of a life conglomerated from what is left in the past and has the risk of being forgotten, but is there, full of meaning and palpitating. The visual arts perceive these subtle palpitations in space. Rosalind Krauss establishes that the image in cultural studies beyond disciplines is a discursive construction. And although photography will always have the weight of being an index, it is above all the physical manifestation of a cause, as are the traces and imprints, and from there the fixed categories are dislocated. Between monument and ruin, between rural and urban, between nature and artifice. So ruin is in between those dichotomies. The work Amarrados, that we see right here, Bound, by Fernel Franco, is one of the most emblematic series of his series as an artist. The images reveal the artist's ability to go beyond the documentary record, to abandon himself to practices closer to abstraction and the disintegration of the object's identity. So one would have to say that he was working in parallel to Oscar, and he was seeing Oscar's work and how abstraction and dematerialization were taking place. I believe in collaboration, in this notion of looking at each other's work and influencing each other permanently. The disintegration of the object's identity. Franco, who developed his artistic career mainly as a visual poet of the city of Cali, which had its greatest boom and decline between the 70s and the 80s due to the phenomenon of drug trafficking in mafias, made his Amarrados between 1982 and 1995 during his visit to local popular markets at night. Everything was packed. The images reveal bundles and agglomerations of objects covered by cloth, tied up for their isolation and protection when they were abandoned for the closing of the various markets. The shots were taken at dawn in the spaces of the deserted commercial galleries in order to capture the object without a single human reference, and with black and white film, very characteristic of his work, when he said that reality should be recorded in these tones because color in photography was pure makeup. In this I also find something very particular to this Cali group. And Ever Astudillo also worked in black and white and drawing and in carbon, and Oscar Muñoz also did that. So black and white were a way of portraying this tropical city without its colors, and more and closer to the decadence. You would say color was pure makeup, color in photograph. Likewise, these photos and other ruins recorded by Franco insinuated death. Photography related to the city, which is central to the theme of this conference, has also historically had an ambivalent position since the marvelous registers of Eugène Atget, made of Paris in the early 20th century. We have seen that the double function of the architecture. We have seen the double function of the architectural record. It initially had a historical mission to catalog places, buildings, and corners of a city whose heritage is invaluable. But in Latin America, mutant processes have been revealed in the cities whose modernist utopias collapsed, leaving ruins that have become an identifying element of our environments, cultures, and pastiches. So these are the amarrados series. We now come to a more contemporary artist that has been very interested in looking at architecture from an artistic point of view, Nicolás Consuegra. He thinks precisely about this from his series Instituto de Visión, that investigate, as Jaime Cerón says, the art curator and critic, the relationship between the disappearance of a fact and the transitory permanence of a remnant of its image. The vestiges of signs and names, because the buildings also have names that are increasingly linked to capitalism and commerce. Resonances of those signs that generate more and more reference of a city. So we see how signs that were originally part of a building have been taken out of them and permanently left in this way. There are traces of something that was there, and actually are amazing images, amazing, I would say, almost abstract images that look into architecture, not from its impeccable constructions, but more from its forgotten spaces. Ritmo de la noche, rhythm of the night. And one has to say that in a city such as Colombia, where things are constantly in transformation because of these phenomena of oblivion and of constructions constantly being torn and built. You know, this is you even currently you walk through a whole block of houses that you would remember as a child, and everything is torn apart in order to make these huge projects of inmobiliarios, of construction. In addition, we're going to talk now about the project Cinema Sostenible, Modernidad Progresista, so unsustainable cinema, progressive modernity. It is about local urban heritages, evanescence, and the history of architecture as a symbolic element. It is based on research of the Colombian artist collective Masqui. They began in 2005, working for more than 4 years on the evolution and destiny of the places in Bogotá in which cinematographic spectacles took place, and their diverse means of signification. The particularities, transformation, and permanences that characterize the social place of the cinema are seen from its architectural and social framework. Through photos and archives, they point out the problems that arise from the evolution of the movie theaters that existed in the city of Bogotá, and which in the course of the 20th century saw their rise and complete disappearance. The project also has its fetishistic and nostalgic component by safeguarding objects that enrich the aesthetic experience of the cinematographic spectacle and that adapt to installation. the theater's furniture, lights, and distinctive decorations, which at the time made the movie theaters a singular space of encounter, very different from the current commercialization projects generally associated with shopping malls and large distribution chains standardized in multiplexes. Leila Cárdenas' work within the spaces of installation, sculpture, mixed media work, and constantly pursues the frailty in built environments as they are printed on transparent and volatile fabrics, whose threads are torn and separated. Also, discarded demolition material is reinvigorated as art form, in new conformations. As Cárdenas mentions, these fragments can be read as a puzzle pieces of a nation's multiple failed attempts to reconstitute itself, or as a door that enables traveling through time. She digs as an archaeologist into urban ruins, and the apparent useless pieces turn into sculptures and poetic anti-monuments of social transformation, loss, and historical memory. Remains, fragments, discarded structures are used as material for her work, with sculpture's strategy that is as much as destructive as constructive. Our body and experience in relations, so our bodies, and such as their installations, they have to reconfigure their experience in relation to new reconfigured spaces, creating new meanings for memory, where the void pierces our notions of time. In the series Más Allá, Beyond, by María Isabel Rueda, she brings together a series of photos and video taken at the dock of Puerto Colombia, Atlántico. So this is near Barranquilla in the Caribbean coast of Colombia, which after a prolonged process of deterioration, this dock is no longer in use. The photos are focused on the architectural constitution of the pier and the signs of its decay. In Victor Albarracin's words, however, there is in them a strong metaphorical charge from which we can glimpse a part of the history of human, commercial, and cultural migrations in Colombia, which with a desolate pier closed the possibility of dialogue with the other, the foreigner, the one who allows us to build a space of hospitality. So there's this violent side of the ruin as a place where humanity is not possible anymore, as a practical space. In contrast, today, we have ghosts, their formless presences and diverse lurkers who threaten us, warn us of dangers, and urge us to separate ourselves from certain waters. Is it not then a mute commentary on the political conditions of our country today? These photos, rather than constituting a denunciation for the bureaucratic abandonment of its structure, try to imagine the persistence of communication in the fragility of ruins that waited in vain for the arrival of the other, and which, despite their evident destruction, try to remain erect, as a silent invitation to enter, and ended just being a space for fishermen. I'm going to show you the video. So this is a fragment of Marisabel Rueda's video. And to conclude, I would have to say the ruin is a denunciation. It's the ruin is a wound, and it's latent in the most recent Colombian creation. The work of Oscar Muñoz being one of the pioneers in understanding that it is necessarily to revitalize the ruin, to rescue experience, to give evidence through processes of decomposition of matter, and the artistic support that we all, and the artistic support to bring up the notion that we all exist in ruins. We exist as ruins. The decayed architecture of the tenements was loaded with solitary presences in his early works. The city was a living organism, a cartography that attacked by violence in the ambulatorio, and his own decomposing body in the Narcisi are signs of fragility and are rare ruins of a spirit, because existence is always ambiguous. We are matter and we're energy that emerges and decomposes. Thank you very much. I was very happy to share this with you guys.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We now continue with Ana Maria Reyes. Ana Maria Reyes is Associate Professor in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture, Center for Latin American Studies and American and New England Studies at Boston University. She is also a founding member of the Symbolic Reparations Research Project. Her 2019 book, The Politics of Taste, Beatriz González and Cold War Aesthetics, was awarded the Association of Latin American Art History's Arvia Award for Best Book in 2020. She is currently working on a new book, To Weave and Repair Symbolic Reparations in Colombia's Peace Process, and she lives and works in Boston. Her talk today is entitled Oscar Muñoz, Breathing Memory into the Colombian Peace Process.
Hello, my name is Ana Maria Reyes. I'm Associate Professor in the History of Art and Architecture at Boston University. I want to thank Vanessa Davidson and the Blanton Museum for this wonderful invitation to discuss one of my favorite artists of all times, Oscar Muñoz, on the occasion of his exhibition, Invisibilia. And thank you to all those who have made this symposium and exhibition possible. Today, my talk is titled Oscar Muñoz, Breathing Memory into the Colombian Peace Process. The purpose of today's symposium is to contextualize Muñoz's works within larger contexts, but there are so many different contexts and discourses into which his works intervene that I'd like to emphasize that my talk today will discuss only one thread of many possible. Muñoz's work traffics in a poetics of uncertainty that by definition cannot be contained by any one theory, history, or even context. I work on symbolic reparations in the Inter-American System for Human Rights, and I'm currently writing a book tentatively titled, To Weave and Repair the Symbolic Reparations in the Colombian Peace Process, where I look at the substantial role that art and aesthetics have played in that same process. Today, I want to contextualize Muñoz's work within that precarious process, but amongst also artists, archivists, curators who have played a role in demanding peace, raising awareness, creating bonds of solidarity, and creating structural transformation for a lasting and sustainable peace in Colombia. Colombia has endured a very long armed conflict or civil war, which is very difficult to speak in terms of time. It defies any chronology. And one could actually say that it begins with the Spanish invasion of the Americas in the late 15th century and early 16th century, but have been aggravated recently by a not so cold war or a dirty war, by drug trafficking, by the war on terrorism, and the consequential fragmentation of Colombian society. The peace process is also equally difficult to define. There are the official institutions of transitional justice that have come out of many laws and agreements, such as the 2005 Law of Peace and Justice that demobilized paramilitaries, the 2011 Law of Victims for the restitution of land and reparations to the 9 million victims of the armed conflicts only since 1985. And finally, the 2016 agreement between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC, that have created the transitional justice institutions such as the HIP, or the Special Tribunals for Peace, the Truth Commission, and other institutions. However, victims' organizations, along with their allies, have been the motor that cornered the government and other armed factions into the negotiating table. It is impossible to deny the impact that artists and activists have had on demanding an end to this bloody civil war and catalyzing a transitional justice in Colombia. In this context, Oscar Muñoz's works powerfully alert us to the collective responsibility in remembering those lost and in building the conditions of non-recurrence. Today, I want to pursue two threads in his artworks that relate to ongoing and precarious peace process. First, his powerful reflections on the nature of images and of memory. And secondly, his art space, Lugar a Dudas, a place to doubt, or a place for doubts, which set an example for the creation of many other sites for dialogue, dissent, and co-creation, crucial to the building of a peaceful culture of respect for human rights. I want to begin my talk with a personal anecdote. When I was beginning graduate school in 1999 at the University of Chicago, I was interested in exploring the relationship between violence and representation. That is the the representations of violence and representations as violence. So I traveled to see the first exhibition on art and violence hosted by the Museum of Modern Art in Bogota in 1999, where I encountered Oscar Muñoz's work, Aliento. It has stuck with me ever since, not so much because it clarified the relationship, but rather because it clarified my relationship to the topic, to the victims, and to the war. As a Colombian citizen, that is not just our perspective, but our responsibility. Okay, let me explain why. In Aliento, Muñoz hangs a wall, hangs on a wall a row of circular mirrors, each roughly the size of a human head. Lured to gaze at our own reflection, we discover that the condensation from our breath triggers the phantasmagorical appearance of one or more faces of the deceased, interrupting our own reflection. The identification with an escaped death is unequivocal. As spectators, we are not given access to the identities of the victims. Instead, Muñoz only gives us a face, a faint one at that, and many questions. Who is this person? When was this picture taken? When was her life taken? The ghostly image calls upon us to speak to, and in doing so, breathe life into the memory of those who are all too often forgotten. Muñoz arranges the press photographs into a grid that evokes the funerary columbaria, while the mirror suggests the reflective surfaces of marble or granite plaques used to seal the tombs. The mirror memorial evokes Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. Lin chose gabbro stone for its reflective properties. such that spectators' reflected images would be visible along with the etched names of fallen American servicemen. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial suggests a mass tombstone that prompts a powerful dialogue between the living and the dead. Aliento forces an even more intimate dialogue, requiring the spectator's breath, a trace of their own living body, to activate it. In Spanish, the word for illusion, or espejismo, immediately makes reference to espejo, or mirror, as mirage does to mirror, and thus summons Muñoz's prior Narcissus series, in which he interrogated the ontological value of representation. In Narcissus, distorted self-portraits emerge from containers of evaporated water to evoke the compulsion to reproduce one's reflection at all costs. Aliento's mirror also acknowledges the human tendency towards self-love, but in this case, that impulse is redirected such that one sees oneself in the face of the disappeared others, prompting a sense of responsibility. The viewer must represent the victim. The small mirror disc, unlike the long processional walkway on the Washington Mall, addresses one spectator at a time, allowing for an intimate dialogue between a precarious and vanishing image of one who can no longer speak and the viewer who's been handed the responsibility to make visible the person's vanishing image. The works amount to a charge from the grave, directed at an individual viewer. I charge you with responsibility to breathe life into my image, to keep my memory alive, to act so that this doesn't happen to another or to you. In Aliento, spectator participation is the only means by which the faces of the disappeared reappear, fostering a sense of collective responsibility for the dead. In the Colombian conflict, the same acts of identifying and burying bodies meant to disappear cast people as auxiliadores, or collaborators, and thus lethally stigmatizing them, to use sociologist Veronica Subillaga's term. Yet, it is the collective responsibility for all the disappeared, addressed one subject at a time, that Aliento suggests as antidote for the recurrent infectivity of war. And of course, the idea of infection and contagion is very timely today with the idea of the risks of breathing without a mask. So in this way, Aliento is further charged within the context of a pandemic. Photography plays an important role in memorialization and bearing witness to history. Photojournalist Jesus Abad Colorado most famously captured the people who have tragically carried the weight of war in Colombia. This image has become emblematic of his gaze as historical witness, but more importantly, of the gaze of the victims on us to act morally and responsibly, to end a war that many refuse to even see or acknowledge, to make the sacrifices necessary for a sustainable peace. It is a young child looking to us to build a future for the next generations. Chucho Abad has used this image to publicize his documentary, his exhibition, his photo book, all titled El Testigo, or The Witness. He also made this image available and printed it poster size to distribute throughout the parades along protesters who demand a peace agreement. In 2016, the government and the FARC-EP reached an agreement. President Juan Manuel Santos then convened a referendum to demonstrate popular support. Sadly, after a massive campaign by his opposition, the no to the agreement won the plebiscite. The weeks between the no and the final signing were filled with street protests, public interventions to exert pressure, many coming from artists. This photograph became an iconic image in the form of the street poster throughout marches, representing the eye of the witness being watched through a bullet a bullet hole in a window by a younger generation expectant for us to do the responsible thing and to end a war that has enriched many and maintained an unjust hierarchy. In Proyecto para un Memorial, or Project for a Memorial of 2005, Oscar Muñoz appeals to our constant labor. Here, with rehearsing the Chinese tradition of water drawing, he recorded his futile attempt at fixing an image by painting a portrait with water on hot pavement, or portraits, I should say. The images are never completed as the water evaporates. He then installs several large format projections, creating a visual rondeau that simultaneously give us different moments of the constitution and dissolution of images, bringing us a concert of the desire for any one full image. Instead, we are reminded that memory is not the task of fixing onto an object, but the perpetual memory work that needs to be rehearsed, practiced. This is a radical proposition in a country with no memory. That, as Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote, will thus be condemned to 100 years of solitude. To retrieve memories through images or retrieve victims metaphorically through artistic practices is one thing. It is quite another to actually retrieve a corpse floating down a river and give it a religious burial. This is the practice that photographer Juan Manuel Echavarria has been documenting in the town of Puerto Berrío since 2006. According to a resident interviewed by Echavarria, victims' bodies are disappeared into the river where the fish disfigure them beyond recognition. In an act of defiance, the residents of Puerto Berrío began to retrieve the bodies and bury them in the town columbaria, or mausoleum. The victims then chose the no names, or NNs, adopted them into their families, and thus wove them back into the social fabric. Echavarria titled this photographic installation and subsequent documentary film Requiem NN in reference to the funerary rituals given to those unidentified bodies. The term requiem refers to both the mass and the music celebrating the repose of the dead. Paradoxically, citizens of Puerto Berrío believe that those who suffered a violent death cannot rest in peace and are still among the living. Those in-between states of their spirits or animas makes them miraculous. They can become actors among the living, interceding on behalf of those who care for them. The living take part in a reciprocal relation with the NNs, the no names, baptize them, give them an identity, a family, and a grave. In return, the NNs grant them wishes. Recipients of these divine favors thank their adoptive NNs in writing and in prayer. Let's see here, by making offerings, decorating, or placing plaques in the funerary niches. Echavarria photographed the niches, changing facades over time, and then superimposed them on these images digitally. He covered each panel containing the overlapped images with lenticular plates that create a holographic effect. Each niche changes with the position of the spectator, evoking the passage of time and changing roles of the NNs and their devotees. The artist visually reconstructs the Puerto Berrío mausoleum in the gallery by arranging the individual photos on a grid. So here you can see the one of the mausoleums or columbaria of Puerto Berrío in the straight photography. Here are some of the still photographs. And here is an installation in an art gallery to replicate the columbaria. Let's see. Echavarria considers his work a tribute to the residents of Puerto Berrío, their strength, creativity, and determination to defy the unraveling of their society. He has spent his early photography career denouncing the historical roots and aesthetic taxonomy of violence. But as he began to do fieldwork and meet those lives that had been devastated by violence, he shifted the emphasis of his work to engaging the strategies of survival. The burial and adoption of NNs and their artistic amplification is a collective conspiratorial effort. According to the inhabitants of Puerto Rio, the bodies are active members of their society, capable of intervening in their daily lives. Following this narrative, the living and the dead resist the complete erasure of those lives and identities that have been taken. They advocate for the NNs as agents of social change and form new political communities that ensure society survival. Requiem NN is a gesture of conspiratorial solidarity with the citizens of Puerto Rio, one that projects a local strategy into the international sphere, making a broader public aware of the atrocities in Colombia while paying tribute to the tenacity and creativity of their survivors. Sites of congregation, like the cemetery of Puerto Rio, are essential for collective grief and resistance, political solidarity to take place. This was also the case for the peace process. Indeed, Oscar Muñoz, alongside with Sara Mizrahi, created the art space Lugar a Dudas, a place to doubt. Seen here, this is an exterior view with its show window external exhibition site. As its name suggests, it is a place for people to hesitate and interrogate, to question and to take uncertainty and ambiguity seriously, and turn these into productive sources of curiosity, dialogue, collaboration, and co-creation, community building. The objectives of Lugar a Dudas align with those of Leonel Estrada, the former director of the International Coltejer Biennials in Medellin from the 1960s and 70s, who maintained a pedagogical mission to nurture creativity as a means of peace building. Estrada firmly believed that war and violence were consequences of society's failure to promote the imagination necessary for peaceful conflict resolution. He cited J.P. Guilford before the UNESCO in 1984, arguing that, quote, a world where problems are solved thanks to creativity is a peaceful world, end quote. Likewise, Lugar a Dudas is a heterodox and multidisciplinary space that fosters artistic production, community building, novel ways of interpersonal interaction or respectful relations, and collaborative work. Lugar a Dudas blurs all contours of the knowable, even distinctions between the public and the private, inside and outside, as we can see here with both in interior community space, but an external exhibition space. And here's the interior. This art space also has a strong pedagogical mission, as its program Uncertain School hints, where education is acquired outside of the academy and beyond conventional modes of knowledge production and instruction. In a country where old formulas have tragically failed, social and relational experimentation are fundamental. Valuing uncertainty and indeterminacy, both aesthetic categories we find in Muñoz's own work, is crucial to discredit the righteousness that has justified war for far too long. So I'm just going to very quickly go through some of these images to show you how important sites of community building, mourning, and collaboration have played here. For instance, the wall, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, is not only a reflective wall where one can see one's own reflection while reading the names of the fallen combatants, but it is also designed in Maya Lin's concept as an arm, as the elbow of an arm, as it embraces a community of veterans that had been left out and rejected when they returned from Vietnam. So the site itself in the National Mall, as you can see the Washington Memorial behind, acknowledges the importance of their service and their sacrifice and embraces them back into society. Excuse me. Likewise, artist Doris Salcedo and Beatriz Gonzalez, along with Mayor Antanas Mocus, realized the importance of symbolically charged sites as a central cemetery in Bogota that was destined to be destroyed in order to create a skating rink. And in this case, the artist Beatriz Gonzalez designed some panels to fill in the niches, evoking, well, first of all, the site had been historically charged by the bodies of a very famous riots from April 9th, 1948, which actually is April 9th, 2005 is the very date that Lugar a Dudas was founded in recognition of this very important moment that was a watershed moment in Colombian history. The images that cover each niche are also a double reference to both the carriers who used to carry travelers through the inhospitable Andean terrain and the more gruesome image of policemen carrying or military carrying bodies found due to the armed conflict. Next to, as you can see here to the right, you can see the Columbario with Auras Anónimas by Beatriz Gonzalez. Because of that intervention, the mayor of Bogota Town Hall allowed for the creation of the Center for Peace, for Memory, Peace, and Reconciliation to be built, which has become an important site of commemoration for the victims of congregation, for activism, and for ritual performances. In this image, we can see here a ritual being performed by the Ticuna from the Amazon and the Yanacuna from the Andean region. And then finally, out of the peace agreements, where one of the points for agreement was the creation of a monument to with the use of the yielded weapons that had been brought by the combatants from the FARC, was the creation of fragmentos. And this is an exhibition hall that I can further develop in our discussion, but for lack of time, I'm just going to show you how these creations of spaces have been so central to the peace process and to this understanding that it's a perpetual and ongoing process, and not in a moment of signing, but of a collaborative, collective creation of a peaceful society. And in 2011, the law, one of the transitional justice mechanisms, which was the 2011 law of victims, created the Centro Nacional, the Museum of Memory, of National Historical Memory, that would be under the jurisdiction of the Center for National Historical Memory, and which, like Lugar a Dudas, has created an archive. And in this case, not only does it hold the archives of many victims' organizations, many organizations for human rights, but it also is tasked with creating and publishing the research and the scholarship of very many different dimensions of the armed conflict. The museum, while the museum has not been built, the site and the design have been selected along the avenue where the central cemetery with Gonzalez's Auras Anónimas and the Center for Memory, Peace, and Reconciliation are located, which is called El Eje de la Memoria, or the Axis for Memory. Indeed, the design for the interior, as you can see here, shows a work by Oscar Muñoz titled Pixels, which I believe is on display at the Blanton. The Museum for National Memory inaugurated a pilot exhibition in 2018 at the Bogotá Book Fair titled Voices to Transform Colombia under the curatorship of Cristina Lleras. Sin lugar a dudas, or without a doubt, undoubtedly, that's where the play on words lugar a dudas comes from. Lleras drew inspiration from Muñoz and Mizrahi's artistic site for her own script. Prior to opening, Cristina Lleras came to Boston University in 2017, when she clarified that the exhibition of the museum would not aim at reconciliation or to represent one or the official narrative of the armed conflict, nor would it attempt to give any cohesive narrative at all, but rather would open spaces for irreconciliation, for holding multiplicity, for practicing dissent respectfully. It would be, in her words, quote, more of a yes, let's be in a place with our differences, hopefully in debate, hopefully we'll think differently, but still be in the same place. Not reconciliation in terms of forgiveness or of being on the same side, but more of a space where muddiness of everything can play out, end of quote. Lleras and her team structured Voices to Transform Colombia along 3 registers, body, land, water, that were intentionally left vague and multidimensional in order to convey the complexity of a war that is fragmented, regionally diverse, and deeply degrading. The temporality and the scale of the war will be dramatically different, let's say, for Indigenous and Afro-Colombians, peasants, women, or urban dwellers. Moreover, the exhibition will not intend to be a house of horrors, but rather a home for the victims to feel recognized and welcomed, while also opening opportunities for interaction, participation, dialogue, and co-creation. As the title Voices points out, it was an invitation to participate, recognizing that truth and history will be told from many different perspectives. Cristina Lleras says we have to dialogue to build trust, to depolarize, to listen to each other, end quote. In this sense, the tasks of these institutions of transitional justice were anticipated by Oscar Muñoz's Aliento, which makes us aware that we are all responsible for keeping the memory of victims alive, for sustaining a precarious peace process, but above all, for using creativity and collaboration to transform civic culture into one of respect for human rights, peaceful coexistence, and caring for each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. That was extraordinarily interesting. And now we move on to our last talk of the day by Bernardo Ortiz. Bernardo Ortiz is a draftsman and writer. He holds a BFA in arts from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá and an MA in philosophy from the Universidad del Valle in Cali. Recent solo shows include his exhibition Balance at Alarcón Criado in Seville, Low Resolution at Casas Reina in Bogotá, Friction at Luis Estrina in Sao Paulo, and Erase at the Museo de Arte Moderno in Buenos Aires. He has participated in such seminal group shows as the 30th Sao Paulo Biennial, the 6th Lyon Biennial, and the 41st Salón Nacional de Artistas, and the 7th Bienal do Mercosul in Porto Alegre. His works are in such important collections as the Tate Modern in London, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Centre National des Arts Plastiques in France, the Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt, the Patricia Phelps de Cisneros collection in New York, the Museo de Arte Moderno La Tertulia in Cali, and the Calles Foundation in Paris. and as well as private collections in the US, England, Brazil, Colombia, and beyond. And he lives and works in Bogota. His talk today is titled Doubt as Ethos, Oscar Muñoz and the art scene in Cali in the late 1990s to the early 2000s.
I'd like to thank Vanessa Davidson at the Blanton Museum in Austin, Texas for this invitation. I must confess that this talk has deviated from its initial course. I wanted to talk about the art scene in Cali between 1994 and 2004, between the fall of the Cali cartel and the opening of Lugar a Dudas. This is a project for a show that will be centered on presenting a context rather than the artists or works that sprung from it. This means, of course, trying to document and show things that are already lost, conversations that are vaguely recalled, works that no longer exist, images that can only be told. Perhaps Juan Mejia, someone who was there at the time, has done it perfectly with the terse descriptions of drawing exercises collected in his series of booklets called Dibujo. For example, one day, a student took over the post of messenger for the institute and made subtle interventions on the packages delivered. Or a student traveled from Cali to Buenaventura, took a picture of the sea and came back. On the way there, they drew a line with the help of a small device designed for that effect. Or a student traced with their video camera for a few blocks the lines on the sidewalk between their house and the bus stop. Or a student drew dots on a TV screen that was receiving static. You get the idea. It may seem almost trivial, but in that moment it was really touching that someone would cross the mountains that separate Cali from Buenaventura to take a picture of the sea. At that time, the road was one of the most dangerous in the country. What was touching was the feeling that violence was always imminent, but there was a way to the sea. How to represent these hidden connections in all their subtlety without betraying the careful tone of the work. That is the difficulty of the project. But as I began to gather material for this talk, I realized that it would be very difficult to translate the whole context of things that are almost invisible, that in many cases are just memories. Lugar a Dudas is the bookend to this moment. Its impact on the scene was transformative. It gave the art scene a place, something that had been lost. When the Cali cartel fell, the city went broke, and along with it, all art institutions. It is worth noting that this was especially true for La Tertulia, which is Cali's Museum of Modern Art. Since its founding in 1956, it was a true meeting place, as its name suggests. A new building was constructed just before the economic crisis hit and left the museum in a very difficult situation. Not only that, this new building changed radically the way that the museum as a public space was used. The old building is open, and it is a place where people, even today, sit and talk. The new building, on the other hand, looks like an office tower, with a high wall separating it from the street. It is a living reminder of two moments in the history of the city. So, when Lugar a Dudas opened, a place was recovered, and that had a profound impact in the city. This was by design. And as we will see, this was a direct result of a very subtle configuration of space made by Oscar Muñoz. As I began thinking about that moment, his presence grew in importance. So I decided to talk about two moments in which I was a direct witness of Oscar's mind at work. These are two moments that are perhaps not well known because the results are not works of art, although that is debatable. One was an idea for an exhibition, the 41st Salón Nacional de Artistas, and the other, the placing of the library at Lugar a Dudas. To me, these two moments are proof of how the work of an artist is a body of knowledge that can be applied. And when I use the word knowledge here, It is not merely a rhetorical device. Art constructs real relationships between things and people that can be read and understood and applied the same way the contents of a book are. There is an odious division of labor between the work of artists and the work of thinkers of art, but much is lost if the thinking that goes on when constructing a work of art is left just hanging on a wall. I want to start with a phrase I read a few days ago. Context is that which is scarce. To me, this phrase forces one to recognize a failure. I'm part of a generation that believed just the opposite, that it was in fact information which was scarce. And this belief bears a great responsibility on the way in which information has narrowed and flattened experience in general. We are all too familiar with this, and I will not bore you with yet another indictment of the evils and perils of social media. But I think the phrase gives us a clue to where to look for possible solutions. Context. Let's talk about context then. What do I mean by context here? There is a traditional and fortunately obsolete notion of art history, art theory, and even art criticism that tends to favor an artist over their specific context, going so far as to use art history itself as the only context. To counter this, most art history today frames the work of artists in economical, sociological, anthropological, even ethnological frames of reference. These frameworks, no doubt, provide a context, but it is a context that is still very broad, especially when the art is there to provide illustration to a previously worked out position, or when the text is written far away from the place where the work was done. I'm generalizing, I know. There is nothing wrong with supporting an argument with art or to establish a dialogue with something that was produced at a distance from the place where the writing occurs. But what the phrase suggests is, to me, even more radical. It's a microscopical reading of a context, one that tries to reconstruct the hyper-local frameworks from where the work emerged. These local frameworks can be reconstructed by paying attention to the way artistic practices were constructed and projected, by paying attention to the intersection between means, media, and the way artists thought about those means and media, to the way they talk between them, by paying attention to the places in the city where these things occurred, down to neighborhoods and streets, etc. These sort of material micro-histories of art could open up ways of thinking about specific works, artists, or milieu. As a sort of footnote, I should add that in the case of Oscar Muñoz's generation, much could be gained if a reconstruction of the conversations between him and his peers was attempted. I'm thinking of Fernel Franco, Ever Astudillo, Luis Ospina, Ramiro Arbeláez, Andrés Caicedo, Carlos Mayolo, Karen Lamazon, to name a few. Whole new theories of the image, of reproduction, of photography, of drawing, of the city could be extrapolated from these conversations. This is particularly poignant, especially because the construction of art history and art theory in Latin America is usually validated through exogenous theories while glossing over the peculiar rearrangement of categories that concrete experience provides. The first encounter I had with a work by Oscar Muñoz was with one of his large-scale drawings from the 70s, one of his Inquilinatos. This particular work was down a flight of stairs in a social club in Cali, one that is famous because a drug lord had it duplicated in another part of town when his application was rejected. It always amazed me how clueless were the members of the club. They couldn't see the irony of what was being depicted and the place where it was hanging. The old, large houses in the center of the city were partitioned, and their rooms rented to accommodate the massive migration from rural areas that the first wave of social conflict had generated in the 60s and 70s. And yet, here it was. Years later, when I met Oscar and had the chance to talk with him, we came back to this idea of the unsuspected destiny of a work. In the 70s and all through the 80s, Muñoz had done lots of printmaking projects. Printmaking was very important in Cali in the 70s and 80s. The city hosted an international printmaking biennial, and in fact, a sizable portion of the collection in La Tertulia is centered around prints. These prints were usually distributed in portfolios featuring the works of various artists, and people would buy them and give them out as gifts. So it was not rare to see the same print in different houses among different things. We have jokingly thought about a project to document the destiny of each of the prints of one of these portfolios, go into all the different houses and take pictures of each print in its domestic setting, and have a huge collection of photographs of each individual print and where it was. I remember laughing because the project is a little bit funny, but if you think about it, it could be very touching to see how a work lives, where it settles as time goes by. The premise of that idea might seem simple, even a joke, but it was Walter Benjamin who said that the idea of life and afterlife in works of art should be regarded with an entirely unmetaphorical objectivity. In 2008, Oscar Muñoz was invited, along with Victoria Northern, José Horacio Martínez, Wilson Diaz, and me, to be co-curators of the 41st Salón Nacional de Artistas. One of the 3 exhibitions that we curated for the Salón gravitated on the impermanence of images, and the key piece of that exhibition was the only known fragment of the first film shot in Colombia. It is a fragment of Maria, a film based on the book by Jorge Isaacs and published in 1867, and it was shot near Cali in 1921 by Máximo Calvo and Alfredo del Diestro. What remains of the film are a few seconds of men on horses crossing a river. Oscar's idea was to project a film onto the ruins of Jorge Isaacs' house in Cali. It is a mid-19th century mansion that stands in ruins to this day, empty and abandoned. To make this projection, we had to find the current owners of the house, so we had to look through city records detailing the history of the house. And behind each change of ownership was a reflection of all the changes that Cali had gone through in the last 150 years. How it was held by members of the local elite, sold to a drug lord, repossessed by a bank, sold in auction, as if the house was always part of all the economical cycles of boom and bust that have shaped the history of Cali. In one of our meetings to get the permissions to project the film, the lawyer that represented the current owners of the house was worried that the projection could rekindle an interest in preserving the house as a landmark, thus spoiling a possible real estate deal. They wanted to tear down the house and build a hotel or a shopping mall. And here, this idea that may have started as a joke with the print portfolio became something truly touching, because the afterlife of the work became unmetaphorical, as Benjamin said. The few remaining photograms of a long-forgotten film could touch the facade of a building and affect it. This idea of an image touching a thing is a reference to the way images are formed. The circle is closed. The horsemen ride their horses on the walls of the writer's house. The person who imagined them a century and a half ago in that very place. And then the fear of the investors, that very image may be bad for business, that its symbolic value might destroy the house's commercial value. These are stories born out of the distance that separates the image from its support. For things to touch, they have to be separated. That is precisely the genius of Oscar's idea, which gave meaning to the whole exhibition. And as another footnote, this shows that a whole exhibition can be constructed from the subtle idea of touch and affection and works having a life of their own in a context. What was an apparently funny or clever idea became a truly moving event once the images were projected on the house, and all those layers of meaning began to move along with the horses. One cannot help but connect this with El Puente, a piece from 2004 in which an archive of more than 3,000 anonymous photographs of people walking across a bridge, taken by a street photographer, were projected on the water of the river that passed below the bridge. One of the most moving aspects of that piece was the illusion that sometimes the images became rocks, mounting some kind of resistance to the flow of the current. It was a very subtle movement of the projector that created this illusion, just fractions of a second before the image seemed to be washed away. In 2004, when Lugar a Dudas just opened, Muñoz had another of these ideas that became transformative. He moved the Lugar a Dudas library into the main exhibition area. In fact, for the first years, apart from the vitrina, there was no fixed exhibition space in Lugar a Dudas. That seemed an odd choice, especially because at the time Cali was going through a deep economic crisis and art spaces were broke. And the obvious thing for an art space would be to have an exhibition room. Just as it would be the case with the decision to project the fragment of Maria on the walls of the house, this was an apparently simple idea that acquired a life of its own. That is precisely the transformative power of space. A simple rearranging brings about different ways of using space and in turn new forms of interaction, of discourse, and of thinking. That is precisely why paying attention to context is important, because the influence of context in thinking has been underestimated. Once the library had moved to the exhibition space, the way Lugar a Dudas was used changed dramatically. It truly became a meeting space for art students from the two art schools in Cali. Whereas before the space had the distant silence of an exhibition space, it was now buzzing with conversation, again, touch and affect. And from these conversations, a number of spontaneous associations between artists, filmmakers, writers, and the general public sprung. In a way, Lugar a Dudas had created an organism that made its own content. As I said before, in the 90s, I sincerely thought that what was scarce was information. But Oscar's gesture was a concrete demonstration that it was just the opposite. What was lacking was context, the kind of context that generates spontaneous dialogue. More or less, the kind of dialogue that had happened in the early 70s among Muñoz and his peers. This is a good place to conclude. One of the terrible consequences of the pandemic has been the shutting down of alternative spaces all along Colombia, of which Lugar a Dudas was perhaps the pioneer. And it is tragic because it shuts down the germination of context, and the peculiar contexts that are part of a city are slowly replaced by a flattening and narrowing of experience. What is astounding is that Oscar has had the ability to put these things in motion without he himself appearing much. Someone that has had the sensibility to rearrange things and put them in touch so they affect and are affected. And he has done that, in silence. So I'll be silent for a moment and let the images of this space do the talking.
Thank you so much, Bernardo. That was extraordinarily compelling. Now we have time for the question and answer session in our discussion. So I invite the panelists to turn on their cameras and their mics. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We do have a question that came earlier in the program, and I'll read it to you. It's from Gina Tarver, who's a professor here in Texas and a wonderful scholar. She says, listening to Jerónimo's talk, I thought of the saying, en un país de ciegos, el tuerto es rey. In a country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, which especially applies to photography of a certain period, characterized by the photographer pressing one eye against the viewfinder. But in addition to the eye, which is clearly important in these works discussed, there is also the hand, which shows up quite frequently in Muñoz's work. In Muñoz's El Juego de las Probabilidades, for example, it is not just that he shows the reworked photographs or photographs of the reworked, or photographs of the reworked, or photographs of the reworked photographs. He shows them as he holds each in his hand. Or in his retrato, the part of the artist that we see in the video is his own hand. Muñoz brings into the frame, which is often the case in his work. By including his own hand, Muñoz brings into the frame the idea of practice or action. I wonder if you can talk about the hand in regard to the artist's role and this idea of the fiction as an approach to reality. It's a long question, but what do you think, Jerónimo?
Sure. Hi, Gina. So it's so nice to hear you're here, and thanks for this question. It's great. I would start by saying that maybe the tragedy of Colombia is not so much that the tuerto is king, but more that a lot of people think they have 20/20 vision. So it's like, and I think that Muñoz sort of like Muñoz's work is dismantling those certainties that are very visible in contemporary politics and just like in the ways that social relationships operate in Colombia. But the hand, it's a great question, and it's great to think about the hand because one of the things that El Juego de las Probabilidades always like, one thing that puzzles me about that work is that the only thing that you see clearly, as you say, is the finger that's holding the photograph, right? The fragmented photograph. And I'm not quite sure what to do with that, but there is something about I think the materiality of the fingerprint that I think it's very powerful and it's very potent there, because the face changes, the whole body changes, but there's something about the fingerprint that stays. And I think that one could see that sort of like creating a dialogue with the materiality of the body, right? That creates that carries its own meaning in a context of war, right? There's something about the materiality of the body that is just undeniable, right? That you have to grapple with, and that is there. So that for Juego de las Probabilidades, and the other ones, I think that a way in which I would connect that to fiction and to the process of creation, and as you say, hand as practice. Well, I think it's a way to emphasize the making, right? The sort of like the role of the artist as the poetic act in the sort of like more etymological sense of the word, that it's just bringing something from nothing, right, into bringing something into existence, and that as something that really necessitates craft and necessitates this shaping of fiction, like again as well in that more like etymological sort of like giving form to things. So I think that the presence of the hand is a way of emphasizing that power of the fictional creation. And also if you think about, I'm thinking also the limited powers of the hand and art making, right, as a tool, but also as as an insufficient tool in a way, and you see it, for instance, in línea de tiempo, right, where the hand is holding the image, but it's inevitably sort of like disappearing. But still serves as a sort of guidance. And then thinking of other works that don't have the hand, like for instance, A través del cristal, it's much more complicated to figure out what is it that you're seeing, right? Because it's you're much more like overwhelmed by stimuli, as when the hand is there to sort of like guide you and give shape to the fiction, I guess.
Thank you so much. And I think Bernardo wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, I think this question is also very interesting because it can, we can go back to the roots of Oscar's work, which is drawing. And I think much of the scholarship around Oscar has always been around photography, and I don't deny the importance of photography on it, but I think drawing is a very important procedure that is almost subjacent to the whole photography thing. And I think it has to do with the hand, of course. And also when we were doing this show that I was talking about a few years ago, and we were planning on showing the work of Ever Astudillo. And one of the things that we showed in that exhibition was Ever Astudillo's source photographies for his drawings of the 70s. And there was a casual conversation, and I'm not sure if Oscar will be happy for me to quote him now, because it was very casual, and Ever was there also. And they talked about the role of photography and drawing at that time, and how drawing was a way of enlarging images, because there was no way of doing this large-scale photography in Colombia at the time. They couldn't make these huge photographies, and they used drawing as a way to enlarge these photographs. So it seems like a very practical thing to do, but at the same time, once they started to do these drawings, the power that has drawing over photography is very interesting, because you can change things. And you can see, for example, in some of the inquilinatos, that the composition is essentially the same. It's also like a variation on the meninas. And things are happening in the same places, but different things, different scenes. People are kissing, or someone is leaving the room, things like that. And that was made through drawing. And you could read that as a deficiency of Colombia at the time, that there was no money to make huge prints of huge photographic prints. But it also, if you read it with the benefit of hindsight, it's also one of the first, I think, critiques of the indexical nature of photography. And we're now living in a post-optical time of the image. And I think these mechanisms, as drawing, even painting in some ways, very difficult now to enter into that, but I think drawing is a very good way of criticizing this notion of the photographic image as truth, that is very much in our understanding of image, but at the same time, it's completely undermined by the fact of a digital image and the abandoning of opticality in the image. And I think this is very important, and could be a very important line of investigation that comes from Oscar's work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I would also add that las impresiones débiles have to do with some of this, at least in terms of the different levels of pressure that he puts on the screen print in order to make different elements appear in the focal point of the photograph that were not focused on before. So there's something about also not only the hand, but the use of charcoal as a symbolic substance that he uses throughout his career, really, beginning with his early drawings. And there's something about that. And the idea that an impresión débil can be literal. It can be the medida de presión, the level of pressure that you put on the print to make a certain aspect of it appear or not appear. But it can also be someone who doesn't really grab you, something that doesn't grab you, someone that makes a weak impression upon you. And he insists upon the duality of that metaphor. So I think we have another question. Did you want to say something, Ana Maria?
Nope,
okay.
I'm good.
Let's see. Here's one in the chat. Hi, this is a question for Ana Maria and Bernardo. I would like to hear a further discussion on the fluid relation that Oscar Muñoz poses between artistic practices and curatorial work. In particular, how is this conceived in a work like El Puente or the projection of La Maria? How, in the case of Lugar a Dudas, how does this limit apply?
I guess I could begin because I think Bernardo can probably answer more accurately the second part of the question. But I guess I would respond by linking something that Jerónimo said, quoting Miguel Ángel Rojas about, and of course, my talk and my research is based on issues of transitional justice and reparations. So my response will be related to that. But I think it's important to acknowledge what Lugar a Dudas does, the role it plays, the function it plays in Colombian society. And when Jerónimo talked about I can't remember what Miguel Ángel's quote was, but in terms of the rigidity of perspectives, right? This myth that Colombians, I think one of the problems with Colombia is that everybody thinks that they know the truth, right? They know what is correct, what is right. And that rigidity of thinking turns murderous, right? To the point where in terms of the history of the peace process, it was the victims that finally said enough with your arguments of just war, right? I mean, the armed combatants and the governing classes and the elites, everybody thinks that they're absolutely in the right. And so that kind of moral authority with the blind spots is something that has to change, right? There's so many different things that need to change for Colombia to come out of the conflict, but the conflict is not between the FARC and the government, right? This is much deeper than that. And so the idea of living with uncertainty, right? Shedding the discomfort with I mean, a lot of this, of course, is recursive because people who live in fear need to have certainty in their life, and uncertainty, as I think it was Bernardo who was talking about, going to see the ocean, you have the uncertainty of knowing if you're going to come back, right? So in many ways, it's not a judgment, but an important rehearsing and learning the ability to live in uncertainty and ambiguity, in the gray zone, in not being able really entirely to know it all. And I think that's a process that is basically sort of a trauma process. And so I think artists, both artists and curators, have to create those spaces, right? Whether they're pictorial spaces or installations. And the curator, they have to allow for uncertainty, for people to become comfortable with uncertainty and with ambiguity and ambivalence, right? And that's, I think, what Lugar a Dudas captures so perfectly in its mission statement, and that somebody tasked, Cristina Lleras is no longer the head curator of the Museum of National Memory. That, unfortunately, is a political position, an appointed position, which is tragic because that who's going to write the script for the armed conflict in Colombia is a major task, and it can't be politicized. But so in answering Julian, hola Julian, nice to know you're there. to answer his question, I think that it's a task for artists, it's a task for curators, it's a task for all of us to build a society that can live with multiplicity simultaneously, because you can't have democracy without plurality, and you can't have, single vision democracy either. So that's more of a political answer to that question, but I do think it's at the heart of Oscar Muñoz's work, pictorial, visual interrogations, and lugar a dudas, which, by the way, I translated as a place for doubt, but it really is room for doubt, because it comes from sin lugar a dudas, which also in English would be there's no room for doubt, and he's opening up the room for doubt. And I think what he means is playing on words, but doubting is not only just interrogating and deconstructing myths, but also to debate and to have a dialogical process of creation. And so I think that curators are important dialogicians precisely because they put works, in the minimum, they put works in conversation with each other and potentially can put the audience in a very productive dialogue with the works. So Bernardo, you can answer more specifically about La María and El Puente.
Well, I think, it was a wonderful answer, and I don't have much to add to that. I think that perhaps in those two specific cases, or the specific case of this projection of La María, I think sometimes the knowledge or excuse me, my English today is a little bit rusty. The level of knowledge that is implied in artistic practice is sometimes underrated or undervalued in this power relationship that is between art history and curating and doing art, because it's very much mystified, but at the same time, it's not taken seriously enough. And I know I'm talking among curators and art historians, so I'm sorry if this is. But in the case, for example, of La María, it was a very simple thing, a simple idea that came to Oscar's mind, that it was just going to project this. I mean, if you're going to set this film in the museum, you would have a very good projection, and it was just 3 seconds of what's left of the first film that was shot in Colombia. But he decided that the best place to project it would be the house where the writer that wrote the book upon which the film was based lived. And this is brilliant because it gives the film a very important, the film image, a support that is very relevant to the whole image that is going to be projected on those walls. And this violates this whole idea of a neutrality or a type of distance that curating always implies. And this could be done only from someone who has been working with images as he had been his whole life. And this knowledge was there, and it opened up lots of different associations for the other works that were in the exhibition. And for example, in that same exhibition was Ever Astudillo's work. And we showed the original photographs where these drawings were based, and this was, and the idea came from seeing the projection on the wall. So it kind of becomes a fluid thing, as the question says, and at the same time, it demolishes the walls between curating and making things that are not quite an artwork, but not quite an exhibition, and also reinforces the idea that I think it's very important that exhibitions are temporary and are a temporary event where things can happen. And sometimes the idea of trying to give them a very stable situation is not conducive to dialogue. And well, the name Lugar a Dudas has to do with this instability, and that is very important. Also, I would add that Oscar is a very, or was a very, I don't think he has done any more shows in that sense, very reluctant curator and a very self-effacing curator, almost like his work Retrato, where his image is always being erased. And he did this, but he never took much credit. And in fact, the work was not credited as his work. It was just a projection, because he was the curator, of course. But that is a very important thing, because he sets things in motion, but then leaves the scene and lets things grow. And I think that was very important then for Lugar a Dudas, because he never, sometimes when people are in charge of an exhibition space or an alternative space, their presence is very much there. And Oscar's presence is there, but at the same time, it's not. So I think that is a very important sensitivity that is at work there.
Thank you, Bernardo. Ana Maria, you wanted to say something else? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. I just want to comment because I love what Bernardo is saying, and I think that we have a culture of control, and I think that skill to be able to do a beautiful craft, because nobody's going to doubt that Oscar Muñoz's work is random in any way, and it's very, it's in very, very polished craft. But this idea of letting go of the outcome, right, allowing things to have their own processes, I think again is rehearsing uncertainty in an incredibly productive way. And I do think that having safe spaces to do that, and being sort of walked through that through art, because ultimately art is one of the mediums where ambiguity can exist, right? And that is very unique to the arts. I mean, I don't think you can have a journalist that's ambiguous or a historian who's ambiguous, right? There's a license that the arts and exhibitions and the arts, and I say in plural, music, literature, poetry, photography, that ambiguity is so, I think, important for us to polish in a way, if that doesn't seem paradoxical. But anyways, I just want to say thank you to Bernardo, because I see this as one of the biggest challenges in the domain I'm working on now, which is reparations. Because when you talk about reparations, what you have to repair is a relationship. And usually it's a relationship of victims to the state. And unfortunately, you cannot repair a relationship when either side tries to control the outcome. So almost essential to the concept of reparations is letting go of the outcome, having faith in a process, or having an aesthetics to a process that doesn't have control over the outcome. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And I appreciate that comment.
So we have another question from Florente Bazano. She asked, what are the plans for Lugar a Dudas, which is such an amazing institution? I'm not sure if maybe Bernardo is the best equipped to answer this.
Well, I don't have, the last I talked with Sally was like in the middle of the pandemic, and the situation was very difficult.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm not sure how it has evolved in the last year. I hope everything is okay. But in any case, and this goes to talk about the Colombian scene in general. There has been closure of most of the independent spaces in both in Cali and in Bogota and in Medellin, and it is really tragic because those were the places where things and where dialogue was happening, and most of these spaces are closing or are closed, or and the thing is, and it has to do with memory and what we've been talking about in the work of Oscar, is that there is no record, or there is very scarce record of these things. And so in line with what I was talking about, when you lose context, you lose history in a very profound way. It's not just the history of things that happen, but the microscopical relationships that were constructed in a space. And that is very, very, very tragic.
Agreed. We have a comment from Lau Rexer. He says, perhaps worth reconsidering the deeper relation between drawing and photography, especially with someone like Fresnel, who could not leave the images alone in the end. Does anyone want to make a comment back to Lyle? Let's see. Do we have any more questions here? We don't. I have a question. I thought it was very interesting, Jerónimo, that you talked about the failure to grasp the real. You talked about this idea of failure, and so did Maria. But she said that ruin was a metaphor for failure, or was it a symbol of persistence? And I'm just wondering if we can kind of reconcile those two ideas. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the idea of failure in your notion of the incomprehensible lucidity that we're seeking.
Yeah, sure. I do think that they can go together, and as a matter of fact, I think it's connected to the discussion with Ana Maria and Bernardo were just having, because it's not sort of like a depressing, fatalistic conclusion. It's not sort of like approaching art or fiction as this sort of like postmodern despair that we have nothing to do, there's no reality or anything like that, but it's just like acknowledging the opacity of it, acknowledging the difficulty to actually understand it fully. Then it gives you room for doubt, precisely, right? Because you understand that the only thing that you can do is attempt to make sense of it and attempt to grasp it, and you can try to refine that with art, but knowing that it's a temporary certainty, if you will, and kind of like it connected to this to the last comment about drawing, because it made me think about drawing as a sort of like technique that corrects the real, right? Like you know, the anthropological drawings that are doing the image better than what the object looks like in reality, right? So it's sort of like fiction that gives you a better grasp of the real, but fails at grasping the real because the real is not accessible fully, and when you think it is, as Ana Maria was saying, it becomes very dangerous, right? Because it becomes a tool of power that allows you to intervene in other bodies and spaces, and so
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. We have one more question it's already 2:59. I think we can leave that comment from Julian for a private conversation. It's about the conflict perhaps between, or the tense relationship between La Tertulia and Lugar a Dudas. So I think we can end rather on a happy note and not talk about conflict. I would like to remind our visitors that the exhibition closes, Invisibilia closes this Sunday. We'll have a tour at 1:30 p.m. in Spanish and a tour at 3 p.m. at 3 o'clock in English, if you're interested in a docent-led tour, but that's the very last day you can see the show. And I just want to thank the Barbara Duncan family. This symposium was supported by the Barbara Duncan Centennial Endowment Lectureship, and the Oscar Muñoz exhibition was generously funded by the Diane and Bruce Hawley Foundation and the Carl and Marilyn Toma Foundation, with the different additional support from Ellen and David Berman, Michael Chesser, and Zacardvi Ayers Vacino. So I'm so grateful to all of our colleagues who have helped us realize this show and realize this symposium. I'm grateful to all of the panelists who brought such intelligence and such thought-provoking presentations to us all today. And now that it's 3:01, our time is up, and we will see you next time.